I'm very pleased to have this forum to talk to you guys, and it's, as Dr. Berzer told me, that you apparently do the readings for your classes, unlike the students in my classes, so I'm going to assume that you have read that, and that'll be sort of a background. And the point for having that, actually what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to try to tailor it to be relevant to your particular class. And so that, the purpose of me giving you guys that handout was not so much that I want to talk about that, in the Q&A. If you want to ask me about some particular question, that's fine. But just to show you that it's at least conceivable that the free market could provide legal and judicial and police services without the government providing it, okay? Because a lot of times when someone first hears that, this particular thinker thinks that the government should be abolished, then, the obvious response is, so people are just going to go around killing each other, and, no, you need a police force, you need laws and so forth to restrain the, natural tendency of man. And so the reason I'm handing that out is because I want you to see that if somebody says I'm against the government providing a particular service, such as police or military defense, it doesn't therefore mean that person says so because it's unnecessary. So just for an analogy, if I say, whether or not you agree with me, if I say I don't think the government has a role in higher education and we should just leave that to voluntary transactions in the private sector, it would be unfair to say to me, oh no, because education is very important, and that's, so what you're saying, people don't need to be educated and schools aren't important. Well, no, it's just I think that the government doesn't do a good job of providing that very important service. Okay, so that's why I was giving that, just to show you the mechanics of it. But like I said, my talk right now, I'm going to try to tailor it more towards this specific class. And let me admit up front, I have never read Kirk before. I've heard of him. But Dr. Berzer gave me this book just yesterday, and so I... Right. So anyway, I'll do my best to, glancing through, I think I have a pretty good idea where he's coming from, at least vis-a-vis my talk today, and so I'll, near the end, try to... address his point of view and tailor my remarks towards that. But let me just very briefly just give you an overview. So, the term anarchism, I'm supposed to be talking to you about anarchism. It means many different things to many people, and so there's several different strands, and I'll talk about them in a minute. But what I think they all share in common is the belief that no one should be in charge. There should be no single authority. So oligarchy is ruled by the few, and monarchy is ruled by one. And anarchy is ruled by no one. All right, so nobody should be in charge. When you say of a given social system, which group of people or which person or which agency is at the top of the pyramid that commands everything below it, an anarchist would say, well, no one should be in that position. All right, and in a few moments I'll come back to this idea just to show you in different areas why that's not so crazy. That there's plenty of things that you are going to agree with me when I give you the examples, that you wouldn't want some one person or one group or one institution to be in charge and have everyone else be subordinate to it. But let me just finish going through, just outlining some of the different types of anarchist thought. So there's one tradition, if you will, where an anarchist is somebody who wants to throw bombs at people, all right? And they meet in little societies and they get nicknamed by days of the week and they go out and foment chaos. And that's, so that is one traditional meaning of the word. And obviously, that's not the sort of anarchist that I am myself, or at least I wouldn't tell you that if I were. And actually, on Thursday, no. So that's obviously that's not what you don't need to be committed to violent revolution in order to think that the current system is illegitimate or unjust. Right, just like you could be a monarchist at heart and think that, I really think we ought to go back to the way it used to be when there was one person in charge. If he screwed up, everybody knew whose fault it was, whereas, with this representative democracy, people, there's no accountability and that sort of thing. You could believe that, and it doesn't mean, therefore, you're going to go try to shoot congressmen, right? You could just, be a very peaceful person and just say, I think that there's a better system than the one we currently have. All right, so in the same way, you don't need to be a bomb thrower to be an anarchist. There's also, which is much more... intellectually respectable, and in terms of historical precedents, probably these anarchists I'm going to talk about right now have the claim of being first on the scene and seizing the term, and those are the socialists. Okay, not all socialists are anarchists, but some anarchists are socialists, and it gets a little bit confusing with the terminology. But the prime example would be Pierre Proudhon, right? The guy, property is theft, that the French thinker who says that, and he I don't know very much about that, or certainly I'm not comfortable to get up here and lecture about it. I have done a little research, and I've gone, on various websites and argued with people in this tradition. And let me just say, for our purposes here, just warn you that these people aren't stupid. All right, that when you think about a socialist, you're thinking, oh, come on, who could possibly be a socialist? And you have in mind, some Hollywood person, and you hear them, they're on O'Reilly and they give some interview about globalization, and you're just thinking, what idiots? All right, that is that's not a fair representation of this line of thought. Okay, I disagree with this line of thought, obviously, but it's surprisingly difficult if you're going to engage these people in argument and you get somebody who knows what he's talking about. It would be really hard to catch them making a contradiction. All right, so I just want to warn you, and even that goes for Marxists as well. In my history of economic thought class, that's what I always stress, that don't dismiss Marxists as complete idiots, even though there's plenty of Marxists who are idiots. That you could be a very intellectual person and be well read in Marx and so forth. And I dare say that the best Marxist would be able to crush in a debate someone randomly chosen from Hillsdale College. Okay, it doesn't mean that person would be right. It just means that he would astound the person on the other end of the debate. So let me just explain. So where are they coming from? You might say, well, wait a minute, isn't socialism when the government owns everything? And so how could you possibly be an anarchist and a socialist? Well, no, because a socialism, at least the people who follow Proudhon, what they mean by socialism is simply the abolition of private property. So it's not that, who owns that field over there. If you believe in private property, you're going to say, well, oh, that guy, Joe Smith, he's the owner of that field. And so for Proudhon, or for people in his tradition, they're going to say, look, you're setting up a system of hierarchy. You're saying that guy, Bill Smith, or whatever I said his name was, that he is the ruler of that piece of property, and any of us, we're a subordinate to him with respect to that piece of land. And so if I am starving and he's got an apple tree across this imaginary boundary, and I cross it to get it, he has the right to shoot me, according to, you capitalists. And that just offends my sense of justice, and I'm an anarchist, and so why would I, say that this guy, Bill Smith, has a sense of power or a, hierarchy over me? Why should his arbitrary win? Because if he says, oh, go ahead and have that apple, that's fine, then according to the private property system, then I can go ahead and do it. And so you see how my ability to live or die, to starve to death or not, is dependent upon the largely arbitrary whims of this guy. And so that's the sense in which they're going to say private property is a system of authority where the capitalists and the landholders and so forth are in power over the working class. That would be generally the way somebody would probably phrase it. All right, so that's where they're coming from. And like I said, I can't go into it any further because I might misrepresent their position, but it's well thought out, I'll just put it that way. So you might be thinking, oh, what about incentives? Why would anyone make anything if nobody owned anything? And they've certainly heard that objection before, all right, and they have a response whether or not you think it's a good one. It's surprisingly difficult, like I said, to argue with them and to catch them contradicting themselves. And basically, when I was trying to argue with them, they actually had me sort of in self-doubt for a while, and basically the thing that brought me back, which I'll share with this audience since you might appreciate it, was that I thought, well, the Ten Commandments certainly presuppose the existence of property, and so, if property is inherently unjust, I don't see why, God would have said don't steal, okay? So that's, so anyway, like I said, it's not that I was beaten in the argument, don't misunderstand me, but I couldn't beat the other person. We sort of had a draw, and so I'm not used to drawing with people when I argue. So anyway, I was surprised by that. So that's where you could be coming from if you are an anarchist and you're a socialist. And those people, if they read the thing I handed out to you, they would laugh and say, this guy's kidding himself. He's calling himself an anarchist. And no, he's not, because he believes in private property. He should stop using that term. We're the true anarchists. And so I say there is some justification for that, because they, I think, did probably have that term first before the last group that I'm going to talk about, the one that I'm a member of and the one that I'm most familiar with. And that would be what's been called various things, individualist anarchists, or David Friedman calls it propertarian anarchists. Murray Rothbard, who was a disciple of Ludwig von Mises, calls it anarcho-capitalism. And the term that I've now adopted, just because I think it's the most informative for Americans, is free market anarchist. And so the idea is, in the same way that you've heard arguments about why we should privatize the postal service or roads or education, those types of arguments are what I would use to say, yep, and we should also privatize the police and the military defense services and even the creation of the legal structure. All right, and so that's the type of spirit in which these arguments lie, and so that's why I think free market anarchist is the best description, at least for an American audience. On that subject, let me just mention one thing, because I was looking at, as I said, looking through Kirk very quickly. You might have the idea that, oh, this is going to be, if someone's a free market anarchist, it's because they have a very utilitarian outlook, and they think that, you add up the costs and benefits, and therefore this is the most efficient outcome, but it's overlooking, morality and things like that. And that it is true that plenty of economists who fall into this category are utilitarians. They make no apologies for it, but that need not be the case. In fact, Murray Rothbard, who is the single most influential person in my own views on this area, he was a natural law theorist, and he had complete scorn for utilitarianism and wrote tons of essays mocking Bentham and so forth, and saying how horrible it was that the utilitarianism swept the economics profession. And so, just to understand where we're coming from, you could, as I say, Rothbard has a natural law approach, and he comes up with his system of what he thinks, are property rights and so on. And so then, why is he an anarchist? Well, because if, for example, if I own my body and if I own my property, my income and so forth, and if we agree that somebody couldn't just come up to me and stick a gun at me and say, give me 10% of your income or else I'm going to shoot you, and you say, well, no, that would be theft. Well, then Rothbard's just going to say, so why is it not theft when the government does the same thing? We call it taxation, but isn't it basically theft? The government is saying to you, give us some of your income or else we're going to use violence against you. Or if I want to start a business, I want to open a grocery store, and the people who own the grocery store in the area come up to me and say, no, if you do that, we're going to send armed men to your house and beat you up, then most people would say, with a common understanding of the principles of justice and property rights and so on, would say, well, that's not right. You're violating that person's property rights. But yet, if I want to start up my own police company, obviously the government's going to say to me, no, we have a monopoly on that, and you're not allowed to do it. All right? So that's the sense. Obviously, it's a very quick introduction or quick summary, but that's the idea in which you could have a natural law basis for property rights and justice and be an anarchist. It's just that you're thinking that you're, the logical fruition of those ideas, whereas the people who believe in government actually always make an exception, that when the government does those sorts of things, it's not illegitimate, whereas if a private individual did, we would obviously label it as a crime. Okay, so that's the different strands, and like I said, I'm going to focus on the last one, and that was the tradition in which the handout was supposed to be. But one other thing, while I'm talking about the different justifications, so as I say, there are plenty of free market anarchists who are utilitarians, there are plenty who are Randians in terms of Ayn Rand's objectivism, and there are plenty who are natural law theorists. And so part of the reason I wrote the thing that you guys read was I was trying to appeal to any one of those groups. I was saying, okay, can I take the insights from all these different groups and not, erect a structure assuming that my reader is a Randian or assuming that the reader is a natural law theorist or a utilitarian or a Christian or whatever. Because if you looked at the values I presupposed, it was things like fewer murders is a good thing, and people not starving is a good thing, and prisoners not being tortured by sadistic guards is a good thing. And there's more agreement on those basic value judgments than on the particular tenets of Murray Rothbard's natural law deductions or Rand's objectivism and so forth. So that was my attempt. Now, of course, whether or not I convinced you is one thing, but I was trying to appeal to someone without presupposing that they had a particular system of building up their theory of justice. And so some people were reading it and thinking I was a nihilist and that I didn't have my own system of values, and that wasn't the case at all. But I'm a Christian. But obviously, if I wrote and said, okay, I want Christians to consider whether government is good or bad, then automatically I'd be eliminating 90% of the audience. Okay, so let me now come back to, I promised in the beginning, I want to give you a few examples of things where there's certainly an order, there's a pattern that's very orderly, and yet nobody is in charge, okay? And so one thing would be science in general. Let's just take physics as a particular example, that if you said, okay, who is in charge of physics, whose job is it to make sure that the current theories that physicists adopt are correct? Whose job is that? Who's in charge? Which committee? there is no such committee, right? There's various journals, and there's certainly physicists who have more prestige and authority than other ones, but that authority isn't the same way that George Bush has authority politically, okay? That, there are some famous examples where Einstein, for example, didn't agree with the certain interpretations of quantum physics, and he famously said God does not play dice. And even though it was Einstein coming down on that side of the question, just the majority of physicists just didn't go along with him, right? So no matter how big somebody is, if the practitioners of the field feel that that person is wrong on an issue, then they just ignore him and move on, okay? So that would be one example. And yet, clearly, it's not as if, therefore, physics is in utter chaos. No, it's very orderly, and physicists have widespread agreement on certain fundamental principles. And but like I said, if you think about how it works, it's not as if when somebody wants to overturn a certain belief or a certain theory that he has to pass it up the chain of command. No, you just publish your results, and then others will try to reproduce the experiments and so forth. And then right there you might say, oh, wait a minute, but maybe the editors of the journals, maybe in a sense they're in charge of physics, and they could certainly, if there were a conspiracy, for example, to keep out certain ideas they thought were heretical, they could just keep rejecting those, but then ultimately the outcasts would form their own journal. And there's no way that, the physicists in charge of the journals right now, the prestigious journals, they can't stop someone from starting up a new journal. It's just that the practitioners might ignore that and say, oh, there's a bunch of cranks who publish in that thing. But if their results, objectively were better than the theories espoused by the majority, more and more physicists, especially as the older ones died out and newcomers came up who had been exposed to all the different ideas since they started studying, would switch to the so-called, kook journals, and eventually those ones would be prestigious, okay? So you can see how it would be silly to say that, in physics or in science generally, some group needs to be in charge, or else, how do we know people aren't going to be out there publishing just fake results, or how do we know that people aren't going to be doing research in the really important areas? Don't we need some central authority to make sure that the research is being conducted in the right areas and that there aren't erroneous results being reported? And the answer is no. And in fact, it's not merely that we don't need it, but it would be detrimental that if there were some group that tried to rein in all the physicists and bring them under control and have central direction, that in fact physics would stagnate, because then all these different people who have all these brilliant ideas on their own would have to first get it approved by the central command before they could go out and work on them. And so ultimately, rather than having the discovery procedure of all these people out there who just might stumble upon something in the laboratory and then investigate further, everything would be subordinated to the few people who were in charge. So even if they were the best physicists at the time of appointment, the chances are that there would be things that would be overlooked, because just no matter how smart you are, you can't possibly be as smart as everybody else put together, or even as you yourself plus everyone else put together, okay? So it's not a matter of we might pick the wrong people to be in charge. It's that if anybody is in charge, then physics would stagnate. Okay, and then another example, and this one might be more relevant in some respects to a system of private law or decentralized legal systems, would just be something like the English language. If I said, who's in charge of the English language, again, nobody is, no group is. And you could say, well, let me put it this way. What if I said, whose job is it to define words? You might say, okay, we've got you there. The people who write dictionaries, they're the ones who define what words mean. And if you think about it, that's not true either. They certainly codify the prevailing accepted definitions, but the people who write dictionaries and publish them are not actually in charge of telling people what the word means. And just to give you an obvious example, if all the dictionary writers got together and said, in our dictionaries, when we write up, let's put as the definition moving towards the ground, it's not that everyone would say, oh, I guess up means down now. No, we would just say, okay, everyone published the wrong definition in the book, and you would stop buying from that publisher, and somebody else would start up a rival dictionary that has the correct definition. All right, so if you think about it like that, there's nobody who's in charge of it, and yet it's also, though, it's a little bit subtler than that, because you could say, well, there's nobody in charge of how trees grow, or so nature's in charge or God's in charge. But there is a sense in which humans collectively, or English speakers, are in charge of what English words mean. All right, so that the prevailing definitions do change over time. That if you try to read Shakespeare in the original, he doesn't use the same English that we use today. And so there's a sense in which all of us, all English speakers, collectively interact with each other, and there emerges the commonly accepted definitions of words, and there are rules of grammar and so on. And that's why people can codify grammar books and write up definitive style manuals. Well, how do you write a term paper? Oh, this is how you do it. These are the rules of the English language. Okay, so it's not pure nihilism. I'm not saying, you can just say whatever you want and that's English, and that you're speaking. It's up to you. That's not true. But it's also the opposite isn't true, that you need to use words in conformity with what this guy over here says. All right, so that's just two quick examples to show you that it's at least possible that in social systems there are certain types of institutions, or whatever you want to call it, that possess some sort of internal order. It's not chaotic, and yet nobody is in charge. You could say that there's an anarchy in science, or there's an anarchy in spoken natural languages. And so that's an analogy that free market anarchists would use a lot when it comes to private law, because I think the biggest stumbling block there, when you're thinking about, if there's not a government, an official designated legislature laying down what the laws are, and you just have all these different competing groups that somehow are supposed to interact with each other, and the system of law is going to just emerge, that, how can that be? That's impossible. There needs to be one person or one group in charge to which all the other ones can appeal. And as I'm showing you, no, that's not true. That sort of thinking is wrong when it comes to science and spoken languages, and so maybe it's also wrong when it comes to a system of property rights. Okay, let me talk about a little bit about what I think what his view would be on this sort of issue, and in particular, what do I think what would his reaction be if somebody forced him to read what you had to read for today? I imagine, and I said I just glanced through this, he would probably say something like this. First of all, he'd be very amused that a graduate student in economics, no less, is going to, pontificate upon how we're going to reorder society, and that would probably amuse him. But beyond that, I think more seriously, he would say, look, history is full of examples of, intelligent people who sit back and try to come up with ways to make the world better, and, and in particular to make us freer, to free us from the bondage of the way things have always been, and the world just disgusts them, and they think it's unjust, and they pine for true freedom, as they call it, and yet every time those things have been put into practice, the result is less freedom and chaos. And so that's why I imagine if he read my particular thing, he would say, that this guy, first of all, where does this person so young get off trying to reorder society? He obviously, there's so much he hasn't read and so many things he hasn't experienced. How could he possibly offer such a system, a recommendation? And beyond that, if we did seriously try to implement this, I am sure something would go wrong and we would end up with a worse system than the one we have today. So, assuming that is where he's coming from, what would I say in response? Well, the one thing that, of course, any would-be reformer says to someone who invokes conservative tradition and so on is that, well, obviously, it's tradition. There needs to be some sense of reform, or else we would always just stay the same. Okay, that even in terms of tradition, that things are slowly changing over time, and that if there is a particular institution or a particular way of doing things, we shouldn't just throw it out because if we think about it for 2 minutes, we can't come up with a justification for it. But if after careful, sober deliberation, it seems like this is really an unjust system, then maybe we ought to think about changing it. And in particular, the founding fathers, the American revolutionaries, they certainly in a sense, overthrew the system in which they were brought up, and presumably Russell Kirk agreed with their decision there. So then I think his counter-response to that might be, okay, but actually the American Revolution wasn't very revolutionary in the same way that the French Revolution was, and that actually what the Americans were doing was not creating a new system a priori from the top of their head, but rather they were just trying to go back to the traditions of individualism, the rule of law, and so forth that they had inherited from England. And so really it was more of a conservative revolt, if you will, rather than a true revolution in the sense of the French Revolution, let's say. And so if that is indeed the way you would explain why the American revolutionaries, why that was a good event historically, whereas modern reformers, especially in the 20th century, all the different visions of utopians, why those were all disasters, I would agree with you for those particular cases. But then I would say, okay, but in a sense, what I'm advocating in that little handout I gave to you is a more fuller fulfillment of individualism and the rule of law than even is guaranteed under the U.S. system. Okay, that really what I'm doing in there, if you remember, I'm not advocating let's get rid of law. I'm saying, no, if you say somebody owns something, that there's a certain property right that somebody possesses, then people can't violate. It is wrong to steal from him, or it is wrong to infringe on his property rights, even if you're the government. Whereas if you believe in a system of government and you believe in the rule of law, what you mean is that, individual citizens can't steal from each other. That's wrong. But if the government wants to take 20% of your income, and if it passes certain criteria, depending on the system, like, the Electoral College elected you, or, a certain number of Congress voted for this thing, well, then it's not a crime anymore to have men with guns say, give us 25% of your income. All right, so that would be one thing that I would say. And then incidentally, I would also just ask you, how true is it that we have the rule of law and the respect for individualism in the United States after all? Because, for example, Bill Clinton was not subject to the rule of law in the same way that people in my theoretical system would be. Now, you could say my system couldn't be realized, but that's a separate objection. I'm saying if you concede for the moment, if that could work, you could see the sense in which I would say, yeah, I believe in the rule of law and individualism, the traditions of liberty derived from England, let's say, and that's why I think my system better fulfills those than the current U.S. system, all right, or Franklin Roosevelt. In what sense was he subject to the law the same way that any average citizen was? And you can see, no, there's a real sense in which he was above the law. Doesn't mean he had complete arbitrary power the way that people in other countries did, but certainly he could do a lot more and get away with a lot more than the average person could. Whereas under my system, there would be no such person that had those sort of prerogatives. Everybody would be subject to the law. So that's what I would say to Kirk if he raised that type of objection. Okay, let me last touch on something that I assume is going to be more relevant to you guys than it would be for other audiences, and that is, as far as Christianity goes, I argue with people in response to things I've written online, and they say, yeah, I see where you're coming from, but as a Christian, I can't subscribe to your notion of anarchy because Paul, for example, in Romans, says submit to the authorities, and that they are placed there because of, God's plan, and that they are, in a sense, representatives of God's justice on earth, and as long as you do what you're supposed to do, you don't need to fear punishment, and if you are being punished by the authorities, it's because you've done something wrong, and so therefore, whatever your secular arguments might be, ultimately, since Paul said that, how can I possibly subscribe to your view? So let me not dance around the issue. That's certainly, that's the most troubling passage for me as a self-described Christian and anarchist. How do you reconcile that? But at the same time, I don't think I'm just ignoring a blatant contradiction, because let me just give you some examples. If certainly many evangelical Christians supported George Bush's move to send troops to Iraq, and presumably they wouldn't think it would be a good objection to Bush to say, what are you doing trying to overthrow Saddam Hussein? He is the representative of God in terms of the Iraqi people, and he's the authority over there, and the Iraqis should submit to his authority, and who are we to overthrow him? All right, that people would say, okay, that's not a valid interpretation of what Paul is saying. All right, so if you at least see where I'm coming from that point of view, then you can see that, okay, so maybe it's not necessarily true that just because of that passage from Romans that therefore you can never object or try to overthrow, whether you do it, with violence or just in terms of writing and try to erode the intellectual support for a particular system of government, that doesn't necessarily follow that you need to support all particular people in power. Now, maybe you do think that, but then, like I said, you can see where I'm not necessarily being hypocritical for not thinking that, since plenty of Christians who are, believe in the literal interpretation of the Bible also supported what we did in Iraq. And then, you could even make it more ridiculous, like Nazi Germany, things like that. And also the fact that Paul himself clearly spent a lot of time in prison, and so I've always been myself just been a bit confused, perhaps, or I'm wondering, I'm not a biblical scholar, and so maybe if I read it in the original, it would make more sense. But I always have had trouble understanding exactly what he meant by that, since he himself, of course, spent time in prison. And again, don't misunderstand. I'm not saying it was a bad thing and that somehow violated God's plan. Of course, that Paul being in prison, he had a lot of time to write letters and so forth. And so, in retrospect, maybe that was what needed to happen. But the idea that many people have said to me that how can you possibly object to the authority of the government because of that particular passage? again, I don't think people would have used that view or that interpretation when it came to other examples of governmental abuse. That, in other words, particular regimes, plenty of Christians think that, yeah, that is an unjust regime and those people should overthrow them. So if you concede that, well, then you can at least see why I would say, okay, so if it happens to be the case that I think that the current system we have now is illegitimate, is unjust, even according to Christian principles, then you can see why I do not submit to the authority. You know, it doesn't mean, like I said, it doesn't mean I go out and, you know, shoot police officers or anything, but that in terms of my, I withdraw my consent, to put it that way, intellectually. And so if you see that, then we sort of backed up the argument, and now we're just arguing over, okay, well, Iraq was a bad government and our government is good, or our government is not nearly as objectionable, and so that's the difference. And once we've reduced it to there, then it's not a matter of absolute principle, it's just a matter of a disagreement about what constitutes an acceptably good government. And let me just end with the prepared remarks, and then I'll open up for questions. You know, where do I get off saying that our particular government, in a sense, is illegitimate? And let me just deal with the most common defense of it is the social contract. That, look, in a sense, we're all agreeing to be living under these laws, and if you don't like it, you can leave. Well, again, any government that doesn't prevent emigration could say the same thing. And then even within that, you can make an analogy and say, well, suppose I like to live in a certain area of Manhattan where the mafia is strong, and they come up and they, have protection money for my shop, and I continue, I pay that week after week because I would rather still live there and pay them the protection money rather than have to move my family somewhere else. We wouldn't then say, okay, so in a sense you're really agreeing to that and they're not really stealing from you. So in the same way, just because I don't want to move to Canada doesn't mean in and of itself that therefore the government's really not stealing my paycheck, even though you can look every month and see how much money the government's taking, and that's certainly not voluntary. It's not that I agreed to that. I didn't vote for George Bush, for example. I didn't vote for the other guy either. But so it's, in what sense have I actually condoned or endorsed this system? And then you could say, well, you haven't literally done it, but you can't get that sort of unanimity individually in politics the way you can, in other sorts of issues. And in a sense, there's a constitution, and our ancestors, they sort of set up this system and we inherited it and so on. And I say, okay, well, if that's your view, that there's this implicit contract between the government and the people, well, the government certainly hasn't lived up to its end. The government doesn't obey the Constitution at all. And so if you do adhere to the justification of this system because of this alleged contract that actually none of us have ever signed, then again I say, okay, well, the government hasn't lived up to its end, so why am I bound by this system? So anyway, that would be my response on that point, and I'll let people go to Mass and then entertain any questions.
I have a question and a comment. The first question is, in history, it seems to me that governments of one form or another seem to rise up in almost every case I can think of. Mm-hmm. And so they seem, in your pieces, seem to indicate that there's something unnatural about government, that it's imposed. And I'm wondering how we bring those things together. And then also on the point about taxation and stuff, the classical Christian understanding would limit government by a standard of natural law and justice, mm-hmm. and that the government is being unjust if it's taking your money when it is not to serve the common good. And so I guess that's a question too, like how do you conceive of the common good? So, okay,
as far as the first question, I'm sure you guys know more historical examples than I do, but just in terms of definition, if everyone really, truly, voluntarily all agreed to a certain thing that they call the government, it would be a club, it would be an association, and that a government, by definition, imposes a monopoly, and, there needs to be some sort of uniformity that, no, this is the group in charge. So, again, I'm not sure. I think any particular example that you give, for example, not everybody with the American founding agreed with it. Not everyone agreed with the Constitution when that was imposed, all right, and so you could say, well, that word imposed, a lot of people voted for it or agreed to it, but not everybody did. And so, I mean, it's not the answer that satisfies you, but that's what I would mean.
Okay.
And as far as the unnatural part, I mean, it's not that I'm saying in that piece that I think that's going to happen anytime soon, or that I think it's likely, or that's even necessarily possible. I'm just trying to show that the way it would be possible is if I could convince a large number of people in a certain area to think like that. And do I think that's going to happen anytime soon? No, of course not. So I think because people do believe that there needs to be a government, that, government is inevitable in that sense, but it's not inevitable, or there's nothing about human beings per se that requires them to all have that belief. They just happen to have it. And then as far as your second one, can you say it again? It was about the common good.
The idea of the common good that let's say in a kind of medieval framework of justice, that not historically but philosophically, that they would say that you have certain rights to property or life and so on and so forth that are inalienable, and by inalienable, at least in some Thomistic thinking that I've read, they mean that that right can be taken away or abrogated in some way for the sake of the common good. For example, if taking away some of my money could better serve the whole, then that is an appropriate trade-off in that medieval framework. And it seems to me that that's something that I was always thinking in reading your piece is, where is the common good in all of this? Because there does seem to be some things that the market would not provide for that I think are very good things.
Okay, again, I don't know that I'm going to satisfy you with this, but let me put it this way. I can't give you a list of necessary and sufficient conditions for what I think the common good is, but I would say that I would rather live in the type of society that I'm sketching in that piece than in the current one. And in terms of, well, what if we all thought that there were certain things that it is okay to take people's money for spending on the so-called common good. Again, if we all believed that, if we all agreed on it, then you wouldn't need force to do it. Right? You could even, strictly speaking, within that system, we could all sign contracts pledging, we're going to all chip in money to the central committee, and then they're going to spend it a certain way, pay dues into a club, and they're going to spend it a certain way. So, I mean, that's, in a sense, providing the meals for the Kappa House, they're all chipping in for the common good of their little community, but you don't need force to do that. That's the member of... So people who think like you do, and I'm not saying it's wrong, could coalesce into their own community and set up whatever sort of system they want. But, so I guess you're sort of asking, what is going to be the complete definition of the specific property rights, and I don't know, and my point is nobody can know. That's going to be a spontaneous outcome.
Okay.
So that was how it is.
Would you have the right to exit? I assume.
Well, a lot of this stuff, it's hard to, for example, just to switch example, do I believe in the right to free speech? Well, in the way people mean it, yes, I do, but it doesn't mean, obviously, that you have the right to have a newspaper print your views. And so really, everything is sort of reduced to property rights. And that, there can be no group that's going to silence me with force because they think my views are dangerous. But if you are a newspaper owner, you don't have to print my letter to the editor. And so in the same way, the right to exit in the abstract, yes, of course I would agree with that, and that's important. But does that mean, that the guy who owns the property that's right next to the harbor, if I want to leave, he has to let me go through his property to get to the ocean? Well, technically no. So it's once you get specific like that, abstract rights, it's difficult to say in practice what would that translate into. But certainly I would say that if the type of society I'm picturing existed, that in a sense people would have the right to exit. Yeah.
From a scriptural basis, apart from Paul's argument about authority, man is fallen, man is sinful. And how government's bad because man is sinful, it'll never be perfect, but there's always going to be people who want to dominate over others and hurt others. How would it work in a sinful and fallen world?
Right, and the standard way anarchists answer that is to say exactly, men are sinful and fallen and want to dominate others, so why in the world would you give this one group of individuals all the guns and all the authority and say, now please take care of us? And I tried to sketch, like I said in that little pamphlet, the way that I think certain rules would emerge and that people would sort of be able to punish lawbreakers. Again, am I saying that, there'd be no murder in this world? Of course not, but there's murder right now, you know what I mean, even with governments. And so I'm just making a prediction that I think that a lot of the root causes, if you want to use that leftist term, of crime right now can be traced to the institutions and the policies of the government.
But did not government emerge because the Second Man fell?
I guess it's kind of going back to your question. Again, you guys know more history than I do, but certainly with certain specific governments, there was some element of conquest involved or some element of coercion being involved with people who disagreed with that particular formation. So when you say did it emerge, I definitely agree with you that people at the time who, 60% or 70% that wanted to form a particular thing and so let's call this a government, or it wasn't like that, but what we would label now as a government, that they were doing so in response to things that they perceived as trends that, we need to do this or else it's not going to affect it. But in the same way, the people in the Soviet Union, when they went communist, they thought it's because look at what's happening, we've tried this other system, it's not working. So even though a group of people think that they need to adopt a certain measure because of the calamity that would otherwise happen, it doesn't mean they were right in that belief. So I do agree with you that historically most people have thought government's necessary, but I would just say that doesn't mean therefore that it was. And again, I agree that human nature is sinful, and that's exactly why I don't want to give one group of people the power to rule over others. Yeah.
One thing that was just a little bit confusing to me as I was reading this is you talked about insurance companies and how we would basically get insurance so that we wouldn't do bad things. I don't really understand how that could work simply because we're making insurance firms responsible for our own sinful nature, so that they are in charge of do we do right things or wrong things. And I understand after that you said okay, well then they won't. Our premiums will be raised, but can you just explain that a little bit more?
Okay, first of all, let me also say, when I wrote that, I was under the idea that this is how it's going to be, obviously, and I'm typing it up, and now in retrospect, reading it a few years later, that's one possible way you could look, and I'm just giving an example of, it could be like this. So it's, even if people did voluntarily all agree, let's go to an island and form a little world based on these principles, it might look vastly different from what I thought of. But as far as that goes, again, I think the best analogy is auto insurance. That, if someone had never heard of auto insurance, the concept, and I was explaining it, you might say, oh, okay, so, why wouldn't I just go around smashing into people? You're gonna pay when I go hit somebody? That's crazy. Isn't that gonna make everyone reckless? And I said, well, no, because your premiums will go up and ultimately, your license would be taken away. And you can imagine someone saying, oh, come on, that's not going to work. If somebody really wants to go out and run people over, those restraints aren't going to affect that person. And so it's the same type of thing here. And, maybe insurance is a misleading term, but the point is, it's the reason you want somebody to be backing you up is precisely because we're in this system of anarchy. And so when somebody, some stranger walks into my town and says, yeah, I want to work in this firm, and you have no idea who the person is, that you would be very reluctant to trust him. But then if he can say, well, no, here's my card, I'm a member of so-and-so, this organization that I have heard of, and I call them up and look at his number and say, are you vouching for this person? They say, yep, if he does anything, if he steals anything or kills anybody, we're going to hunt him down and we'll take care of it, but we will pay you off. And so then I say, okay, well then I trust him more and I let him. And so that group isn't going to last very long and isn't going to be reputable if they're not very careful about who they let into their organization and give a number to and then vouch for. So that would be, I don't know if that helps any.
Well, but then if you're trusting someone, if you're saying, oh, yes, I trust you to vouch for this person, isn't that contradictory to, oh, we don't trust the man to be in charge of us in general? Or is it just one little person vouching for someone, so then it makes it okay to trust someone, but if it's someone in charge of all of society, that's not trustworthy?
If I understand, Dan, I mean, so I don't know if this is answering, but clearly that all those people, this company might be a big sham or something, but the point is, over time, when they're dealing with other people, we can see their record, and they wouldn't have a big name unless they had a history of dealing fairly with other people. And so even today, I could just turn around and say, oh, well, how are we going to have a system? But you're going to have judges and courts and so on. But if man's fallen, how can we trust the judge? I mean, so ultimately, if there's going to be any way in which we try to influence what others do, there's some sort of intermediate system of incentives or punishments or what have you. And yes, no individual is ever fully trustworthy, but that's why you have the system in place to hopefully, get rid of such people when they do something wrong. Yeah.
As in high school debate, we had a resolution to ask whether tyranny or anarchy is a preferable situation. And I think I was trying to come up with some examples about historically examples of anarchies that were successful, and I think there's some theories that perhaps during the Articles of Confederation, the United States was something like an anarchy, and Iceland perhaps in the past has been. I wonder if you have any examples of successful anarchies that have been in history.
No, the ones you mentioned are the only ones that people ever bring up, and even there, I would say that those don't totally live up to the sort of thing that we have in mind. And so there's different. So one sort of glib response would be to say, look, suppose I tell you that I wish we could live in a world where there wasn't rape and murder, and then you say, oh, can you point to a society where there's never been rape and murder, and therefore my ideas are wrong? That would be inappropriate. So the fact that I'm espousing this sort of thing as I think this would be a better system just because it hasn't ever existed in and of itself isn't, I don't think, a valid objection. But then, in fairness, you could say, well, isn't there some historical evidence that this sort of thing could work? And that's why I was trying to go through and use analogies all over the place to show you, it's hard to get out of the mindset, but imagine if you went back when there was still a guild system and you told people, no, we don't need to have guilds telling everyone what their occupation is. Just let everyone choose whatever job they want, and wage rates will adjust to make sure that there's enough bread being made and enough shoes and so on. People would think you were crazy and that you were a utopian dreamer, and no, we need to make sure, that's nice in theory, but let's make sure that these things get satisfied. So, to answer your question, no, the medieval Iceland is David Friedman wrote a few articles on that, and that's probably the closest thing to what I'm talking about here. And beyond that, I would just say no, that nothing has ever really approximated this, and it's, we can see historically the case that the U.S. is, in many sense, in some sense, better than other systems of government, and I don't think it's because of, that the Constitution or whatever is so good in terms of its positive features, but that it limits government. And so I do think historically it's true that, that government is best which governs least, and so therefore anarchy doesn't govern at all, so that should be the best of all, right? And I know that argument in general isn't valid, but that's what I would say in terms of historical evidence. And also just any particular thing you want to talk about, I can certainly say to you why I think the government's messing up that one area. It's not that the government right now does anything that I think it's doing a good job in, and so those would be, my arguments as to why, therefore, I think that the government, if it were gone, would be a lot better. Not that it would be perfect, but there'd be a lot of things that currently happen that wouldn't happen. Yeah.
All right, a lot of things I'm sympathetic with in the article, but it would be cool if 500, me and my friends, whatever, and we went out and did something like this. Mm-hmm. But what I think about is kind of large-scale military action. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think you'd ever say that the whole world's going to do this at the same time.
Right. And
if, let's just say, France does this, mm-hmm. how are they going to be able to deal with, the armies outside and so on and so forth? Because it seems to me like the early Middle Ages is a decent example of almost total decentralization. What happened was, all bullies went around and oppressing people,
right.
And they weren't able to handle huge Vikings and Magyars and Muslims and stuff. So that's my
right. Well, you should have gone to my talk a few weeks ago on privatizing the military. But let me just try to give you a quick answer. So, like as I said, I was just answering the last question. I meant it when I said no matter what the government does right now, I think it botches the job, and it even comes to the military. And you can say, what are you talking about? We went over there, look at what we did in Iraq. We certainly, in terms of the military confrontation, we beat them. There's no doubt about that. And so, yeah, but the U.S. government is good at fighting other governments, and so that doesn't prove that government is a good thing to wage war. And look at how much more trouble the U.S. government is having against the decentralized resistance, or against the Viet Cong, or we can't catch Osama bin Laden. So one person has eluded a coalition of the strongest governments for years now. And so, yes, governments can build up impressive armies and so forth, but for all the reasons that government's not good at curing poverty or fixing education, I also don't think the government is good at preventing terrorism. And to try to you talk about France, well, the statist system, the centralized approach to defense also didn't work for France against Nazi Germany. Am I saying that if the French had been organized along these lines that they would have been able to repel a Nazi invasion? I don't know, but I think they would have been better than they were. Because think about it, under what happened on their system, that the Maginot Line, that one guy had an idea, and that's what they threw everything behind, and that idea didn't work, and then they were in trouble. And that would sort of be like in the Soviet Union when it comes to something like bread production, that the central plan said this is the way bread's going to work, and it didn't work out, and then millions of people starve. Whereas that doesn't happen in the U.S. because even if one particular grocery store screws up, then you just go somewhere else to get your bread. And so in the same way, if there's not one group or one body of individuals in charge of defending the country, then there's a bunch of different competing ones. They all have different ideas. When the war happens, if a few of them guess wrong, then they're going to get wiped out. But then the other ones who did the other things are going to last longer. So that would be my very quick. And then to give you another, just historically, look at the colonies were able to defeat the British Empire or fend off the British Empire, the strongest thing in the world at the time, and yet, and they were in a sense, it wasn't anarchy, but it certainly wasn't a centralized system. There was many militias and so on. Whereas, look at during the Civil War, on paper, plenty of people right at the outset thought the South was easily going to survive. But just in terms of look at how big the South is, and they have the access to the oceans and so on, and if the South used the tactics that the American revolutionaries used against the British, of course the South was going to repel Northern attacks. But what did the South do? It had generals trained at West Point, and if you think about it, they said, okay, they took their own people with guns and they pointed at all their able-bodied men and said, okay, get in line and go march against Union cannons. And so in terms of, is that really the smartest way to use your resources to organize your defense against a stronger opponent? Then no, I think the draft is the absolute stupidest thing to do. That you're literally taking your most important resources, your able-bodied men, and sending them off against cannons. So to answer your question, no, I think for given other things equal, in particular whatever your resources are, your tactics and your weaponry, if it's organized under a decentralized system, then it would be more effective. Just as when it comes to making computers or cars, it doesn't follow that, well, what if you really had to compete against the Japanese? Don't we need the government to get involved to make sure our computers are really good? That argument wouldn't follow. And I say the same thing when it comes to something like military defense. Yeah.
You said, back to one of your points in your central analysis here, you had said that our government is not just because they're taking our, we can't leave. Just because we can leave, doesn't mean we're giving them implicit consent. Because we haven't signed a contract. Sorry. Just because we're here and staying here, not going to another country, doesn't mean we're necessarily giving implicit consent. Because it doesn't justify the country for taking our taxation. Well, if we put it down in the smaller scale of your insurance companies, just because one insurance company is unjustly acting, and in the long run it might fizzle out, or I have the choice to move to another insurance company, how does your idea of justice play out any differently on a small scale than it does on a large scale?
Okay, well, if what you mean is the insurance company, we had an agreement that I was going to pay them $100 a month and they were going to insure me, and then I get into it and they start sending me bills for $200 a month, and then I am, it's just not worth the hassle to me of switching companies, and you're saying, yeah, I would say, yeah, they're stealing $100 a month from me. So I think I'm being consistent, and the point is just, but a company that did that is going to go out of business because people don't think that private companies have that right to do that. Everyone would recognize that as outright theft or fraud, and that company's going to go out of business. Even if I don't do it myself, enough customers are going to switch that presumably that's not going to happen over time. Whereas with the government, it's the same exact thing, and so I consistently say yes, and it's stuff when the government does it too, but for some reason most people don't mind when the government does it, or they think, no, well, because the government needs to exist, it's okay when they do it, and that's why we don't just withhold our consent and get anarchy. Is that at all answering your... So I think I'm being consistent.
Well, if we can leave an insurance company because we are dissatisfied with it, well, we can also leave a country because we're dissatisfied with it. You said that, well, just because we're staying here doesn't mean we're giving implicit consent. But I would argue that if you're going to put yourself under a system where you are giving implicit consent to these different insurance companies, you're doing the same thing on a small scale that you would be doing in, say, America by staying here.
So are you just trading public power for private?
Exactly.
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. I'll try one time to say in different words. So again, the claim is I'm saying, look, I don't agree with this system right now, and so someone would say to me, well, then why are you staying here? In a sense, you do agree with it. And I want to say, no, I want to say, because I don't like what's going on, just the fact that it's not worth it to me to leave doesn't therefore mean that I agree with it, and that it's not, and that therefore it's just. So I'm saying the exact same way, if I'm getting ripped off by an insurance company and I'm complaining at lunch, if someone said to me, well, if they're bothering you so much, why don't you switch companies? I wouldn't say, oh yeah, you're right, I guess they're really not stealing from me. I'd say, no, they're stealing from me. I'm not going to switch companies, but they're still stealing from me. So I think I'm being consistent. And then just the empirical or pragmatic argument is, I'd much rather have a bunch of little companies, any one of which might steal from me, and I can switch pretty simply, rather than saying, if the government starts, mass murdering people, then we can all move to Canada. And that's the ultimate check on why our government doesn't set up concentration camps, is that we could all leave. Yeah.
From reading the essay and listening to your lecture, I noticed two things, two themes really. One, consent, and two, sort of a state of nature theory that you have, in that a man is born into this world apart from any sort of responsibility to other men or institutions. And I'm wondering how you respond to someone like Kirk, who would argue from Burkean standpoint that man is born into certain responsibilities, that you're arguing that the government is stealing from you because you never consented to that government. How do you respond to someone who would say, no, that's not your choice. Part of the state of nature is being born into a government institution, and certain other responsibilities. For example, parents. You're born under your parents' rule, and it's not your choice, but you're still obligated to them. How would you respond to someone like Burke, who would say, yes, the same goes for the government, but the same goes for certain other responsibilities. The state of nature isn't entirely detached from all of the institutions.
Right, okay, that's a good question. All of them have been good questions. So one quick thing would be to say, obviously, again, it was sort of the answer I gave before about trying to address what Paul says, that, you wouldn't say that to necessarily people in Iran or Iraq that, stop complaining about the people in charge of you because you were born into that system and you have responsibilities to Saddam, that's most people would agree. Well, no, it's fine for them to think their system is unjust and to take measures to get a different one. And so in the same way that, I look at it, it's not that I'm just whining and saying, oh, I don't like this system because it doesn't suit me. I'm giving reasoned arguments that in other contexts people would agree, yeah, if somebody did this to me, if I just talked about this group that was doing stuff to me, and you'd be getting outraged and saying, why are they doing that? I say, oh, by the way, it's the government. You say, oh, okay, well, that's why they can do that to you. And so anyway, that would be a sort of glib thing. And then, more generally, it was difficult to write this because, in the sense of the contract stuff, that, how can you talk about what voluntary is or what consent is unless you know going into it who owns what or what people's rights are. And so don't you need this whole body of sort of a priori deduced rights theories, or at least something you have in mind, in order to say, what do we all start out with at the outset, and then we can do voluntary trades. And of course, that doesn't make sense because, like you're saying, you never start at the outset. We were born into the system. So that is a problem. But I do think there's a certain sense in which you think, no, I really do own my house, and the government just taxes. I have to pay property taxes. Because the way you could reformulate that so everything that happens right now is consistent with my view is to say that the government actually owns everything, including your body, and that's why they can draft you and so on if they choose to, according to certain procedures. And then that we're all, just agreeing to live on the land owned by the U.S. government. But I don't think that's what people really believe. And so I'm not denying that you have responsibilities that you didn't necessarily choose and you were born into them, but I do think that there is a consensus on certain issues of justice that even Christians would agree with in other contexts. And I'm just trying to show why is it qualitatively different when the government does it. And to the extent that people think, well, because we need a government, otherwise there'd be chaos, that's what I was trying to argue in that pamphlet, that not necessarily.